We'll start in just a minute. Okay, good evening, and welcome to the Stanford Global Studies Summer Film Series. My name is Christophe Crombez, and I'm a senior research scholar at the Europe Center at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I am organizing this session together with Shannon Johnson, who is one of our administrators at the Europe Center. And today we're going to talk about a movie related to the theme for this year's summer series, the film series, Oceans That Unite and Oceans That Divide Us. The movie that we're going to discuss today is called The Swimmers. It's a movie from 2022, and it's also the second movie in the series, in the summer series. The third movie, I can already tell you, is going to be at the end of August, on August 30, and it's going to be called Jahaji Music, India in the Caribbean. So it's about Indian music in the Caribbean. So that will be on August 30. I am not a film critic. I'm a political scientist, a political economist. I'm going to lead this discussion, but I do not want to turn this into a monologue or monopolize the conversation or the discussion. So I'm going to ask you to share your opinions, your findings, your sentiments about the movie. I'm going to ask some questions. You can ask some questions as well. You can ask questions by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or it should be at the bottom of your screen, I guess. And alternatively, you can just raise your hand. That's probably better. We're a small group today. There are 16 people present today at this point, so you can just use the raise your hand feature, and then I will recognize you. You can leave your cameras off, as most of you have chosen to do, but to make this discussion a bit more personal, you can also turn on your video, your video, so that we can all see each other, whatever you prefer. As Shannon mentioned in the beginning, this session is being recorded and will be made available online also. So please be aware of that. So as I said, I'm not going to be the person doing all the talking today. I watched the movie just like you did. I don't have any particular expertise on movie making. I'm not a director. I've never taken any film class or anything. I do teach European politics, and as a result, since the refugee crisis in Europe has been quite a topic in European politics in the past 10 years, especially in the 2015-2016 period, I do talk about this and devote a number of classes and a number of sessions to this topic. So that I look at it more from a political perspective. So I'll start with my series of questions, and then you can participate whenever you want. So the first obvious question, of course, is what you liked about the movie. And of course, that will be followed by what you didn't like about the movie. I can give you my opinion about this, but I will give you some time first to think about an answer yourself. And in the meantime, I'll just try to summarize the movie a little bit, the way I see it. So I look at this as a movie that is mainly about the two sisters that are growing up in Syria. They're affected by the civil war in Syria. And as many others in their generation and older people also did, they decide at some point to leave Syria and look for a better life in Europe. What is particular about these two sisters is that they are both into swimming, and they that will be play a big role both in the process of their emigration to Europe, and also once they end up in Europe, in Germany. So they, after some difficulty trying to convince their parents, and particularly their father, they managed to leave Syria and leave the civil war. And they embark on a very harsh journey throughout Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, to finally end up in Germany. In Germany, then, they are put into basically the asylum system, and they apply for asylum. And in a lot of countries, including in Germany, including in my country where I grew up, at least in Belgium, this takes quite a long time. So they're stuck. These two sisters are stuck in this facility where they have to wait until their applications have been processed. And then they find a swim coach who's willing to coach them. And one of them, at least, then manages to compete in the Rio Olympics. So what I found particularly interesting and most delightful about this movie is that it talks about the refugee crisis from the perspective really of the refugees. I look at it at a problem, at a refugee problem, mostly from a political perspective, of course, professionally. This movie tells the story from the perspective of the refugees, which is in many ways, I believe, a lot more convincing than even sort of a documentary about what is going on the Greek island of Lesbos or something like that, as I have seen in the past. So I think, personally, the movie managed to bring across sort of how harsh this ordeal is that these two sisters found themselves in. I think the movie did a very good job at bringing that across. That is, I think, in my opinion, the main positive point about this movie. Is there anybody who would like to express their opinion also? I see some people, Lynn mentions here the movie is about the plight and the tenacity of the refugees. I didn't emphasize that second point, but it is, of course, also something that is very clear in this movie. These two sisters are probably more courageous than a lot of other people would be in the same situation. They are very persistent, even when they have reached Germany already. And that is one of the reasons why they attain their objective. Anybody else who would like to say something about what they liked about the movie or why they liked it? Who saw some other positive points in the movie? Let's see.
Hi, Chris. My name is Anne. Can
Hi.
you comment about your perspective as in political science view? Because I'm a refugee, so I can totally relate it to the refugees' point of view, but I want to hear about your point of view.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Actually, I will do that in just a second. it's a very, I mean, one of my questions later on was going to be, I was going to see whether anybody had more of a personal perspective on this story, either because of their background, maybe in the Middle East, in Syria, or having helped out refugees. I know a bunch of people here also went to Lesbos and other Greek islands to as aid workers, basically, or whether anybody here would like to share their experiences as refugees. So if you want to do that later on, you're definitely welcome to do that. Now, how do I look at the refugee crisis? At what happened mainly in 2015 and 16, but as you know, and have probably heard also in the news in the past year, this is a situation, a crisis that is still going on to some extent. There are still boats that are capsizing in Greece, and recently there were quite a number of cases like this, and quite a number of people have died as a result of that. And people have also been very harsh, very critical on the Greek government for not doing enough, and sometimes letting knowingly, or you could think knowingly, letting basically these boats or these refugees, leaving them in a situation that was basically without any perspective, and that led to their death. But anyway, so this has been one of the main crises in European politics in the past few years. Now, there's been no shortage of crises. If you look at the past 10 years, there's been a number of other huge problems in European politics, maybe even more so than in the United States. And the financial crisis that hit the US in 2008 eventually led in Europe to a sovereign debt crisis that affected the monetary stability. Also, the euro, the survival of the euro was at stake at that time. There's also the rise of the far right that creates political problems. And the refugee crisis is another example of these crises that the European Union has experienced in recent years. Now, that crisis reached its peak in 2015, 2016, as a result of the war in Syria, which arguably was also a consequence of what happened in Iraq and in other countries in the Middle East around that time. Now, if we look at Europe with respect to immigration and the situation as it is today, even though Europe doesn't have a reputation of being an immigrant country as opposed to the United States, I think a lot of the political discussions around immigration today in Europe are very similar to the discussions that are going on in the United States. And the economic and demographic situation is a little bit similar as well. If we look at Europe, if we look at the United States, these are two parts of the world that are doing relatively well economically, and where people have become more prosperous. And very often in a situation like that, and that has happened in North America and in Europe as well, the demographic evolution is not very favorable in these societies that have reached this type of level of prosperity. So basically, people are having fewer kids in Europe, and that is the case in the United States as well, compared to 50 or 100 years ago or something like that. Now, there are many reasons for that, of course, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But if you look at it demographically and also economically, that means that North America and Europe both have a need for immigration, basically, for immigrants, or if you want to express it economically, there's a shortage of labor. And in the post-pandemic situation, it is even clearer in North America as well as in Europe. There's a shortage of labor. And how are you going to resolve that? Well, one way that the US does that to a large extent is through immigration. And very often in the US through illegal immigration, because the immigration system hasn't really changed or adapted very much over the past 30 years or so. Now, Europe is historically not a country of immigrants or a continent of immigrants, but it has attracted a lot of immigrants in the past few decades. You could say as a source of labor. As an economist, I look at it that way to some extent. And in the second part of the 20th century, a lot of these immigrants came from Turkey and North Africa. Now, one of the problems with this has been that a certain segment of the population has not been very favorable to this immigration. Just like here in the United States, there's resentment against or negative feelings towards immigration from Mexico and other southern countries amongst certain parts of the population. Now, but in any case, there is a demand for immigration or a need for immigration in Europe. And as a result of that, I often say, and I'm not the only one, and that's also what I say in my class when I talk about the refugee crisis, people refer to this typically as a European refugee crisis. And a lot of people would say that this is not a European crisis, that it's not a refugee crisis, and that it's not a crisis at all. So you can question each of these three components of this term, the European refugee crisis. And one thing that I would say is that for Europe, contrary to the impression that is usually created in the media and by a lot of politicians, for Europe, this is not really a crisis. Europe can deal with this. In 2015, I believe there were, at the height of the crisis, there were in a one-year period about 2 million refugees. Europe or the European Union has 500 million people. Europe can deal with this, and this is not Europe being overwhelmed by refugees or immigrants. We have the ability, or Europe has the ability, to deal with a large influx of immigrants, especially since some countries, especially like Germany, actually need immigrants and need labor. So you can wonder whether it's really a crisis from the European perspective. Of course, for the people involved in it, for the refugees, for the people who are leaving their country because they experience war or persecution, this is a crisis, of course. But to say that it's a huge crisis for Europe is a little bit over dramatic. Europe should be able to deal with this. The other component that I will address second, referring to this as a European crisis, is not really all that correct either. It's a crisis for the people involved. And if we focus on the problems that's refugees and hosting or welcoming refugees that come with that, then Europe is not the most affected part of the world either. There are a lot of refugees elsewhere in the world. And even if we just focus on Syrian refugees, most of these refugees, a majority, actually did not end up in Europe. They ended up in the neighboring countries, in Turkey and in Lebanon. So to the extent that these refugees create a crisis in the country where they end up, the situation is a lot more precarious in Lebanon and in Turkey than in Europe. And then there's a whole discussion that is typically going on when you have refugees, whether these refugees are really refugees or economic migrants. Most people who have studied this would say that in 2015-16, that we were really talking about refugees, but some people in politics and in the media would contest that. So I basically, if you ask me, how do I look at the refugee crisis? I would say, of course, this is a human tragedy for the people involved. I think that Europe should have a more positive attitude toward immigration. Europe needs immigrants, and unfortunately, our politicians in Europe, but that is to some extent also the case in the United States, don't have the courage to make that clear to their voters and find it easier to just go along with the anti-immigrant sentiments that some parties, especially on the far right, propagate. And a lot of mainstream parties have, to some extent at least, copied that rhetoric and also the policies that they want to implement to deal with it. These are some of the ideas that I have about the refugee crisis. I don't know whether this was a good summary, or whether you would like me to elaborate more on some of these points. Let's see what comments I see here. Okay. Something about sister statement to the Olympian, you're soft on the outside and hard on the inside. Okay. Yes, I remember that comment also. Yeah, and then one of you, Peggy, refers to the father's fears. I think to some extent what was going on also when the sisters wanted to leave, to some extent, I think a good part of the father's reaction was sort of what you would expect as a standard father's reaction. Somebody who's of course concerned about his daughters, but maybe also a little bit sort of I don't know, to some extent maybe also wants his daughters to achieve those things that he was not able to achieve himself. A comment that people often make about parents. So I think that was probably also something that was going on right there. Anyway, any other questions about the refugee crisis, since we ended up mostly talking about that from a political perspective? No? I can say more about this I will if the discussion doesn't go in any other direction. What is happening now in Syria? I'm not a specialist of Syrian politics. I'm more a specialist of European politics. But as far as I know, the situation has still not stabilized. So I think at some point it looked very bad for the leader, for the regime that has been there for the last few decades. But he has managed to stay in power. And I think his fortunes have improved also because of all kinds of arrangements and deals and the interference of Russia. There are still refugees coming to Turkey and so on. So I think for the people who live there, for a lot of them, the situation is still not as good as we may want. Anything else? Maybe I'll say a few more things since you were talking about the refugee crisis. I'll say a couple more things about what it shows us about Europe. So one of the things that happened in this crisis is that, of course, most of the refugees from Syria and elsewhere entered Europe from the south. Italy and Greece were the two main countries that basically were the point of entry into the European Union for these refugees. Now, most of these refugees did not want to go to Italy or to Greece, just like the refugees in this movie. They wanted to go more north, further north, where to countries that are richer than Greece and Italy, and where, as a result, there would also be more opportunities, more economic opportunities, more employment opportunities. Now, because the European Union, or most of the EU countries and some other countries as well, have created what is usually referred to as the Schengen zone, the Schengen area. And that is an area in Europe where you can, as a lot of you know from their experience traveling through Europe, where you can travel without having any passport controls and so on. Because the EU has set that up, you can basically enter Italy or Greece or any other country. And then once you enter that country, you can freely travel to any other country in that area. Of course, people know that. And as a result of this, people who wanted to go to Germany, they have done all they can to enter, to reach Greece or Italy. So in a way, Europe creating this passport-free travel zone has made it, you could say, maybe more attractive or easier for refugees to enter the countries where they really want to be. And they have put an extra burden on the countries in the periphery, on Greece and on Italy. All these refugees are entering through these countries on the southern border of Europe. And that has, of course, put extra strain on their immigration system. So Europe, often when they make some steps towards unification, when they unify their policies, they make one step, but they don't necessarily take some other steps that they should take as well if they want the system to function properly. That is, what do I mean in this case? If you create one large area where people can move freely once they enter that area, then probably you should also set up a well-functioning system to welcome or to screen people who enter that area. So in my opinion, it would have been logical for the European Union to take over the customs and border agencies that each of its 27 member states have. But they didn't do that. Why? Because, as is often the case, member states want to hold on to their own sovereignty, and they didn't want to give up control over their own borders. And that is also true for Greece and for Italy. They didn't want to give up control over their own borders. They didn't want to give up that control to the European Union. And for a while, that worked very well. This large area where people could move freely, that functioned very well. It was very good for Europe, as long as there was not much pressure on the outside borders. But when that pressure increased and when Europe had to deal with a large wave of immigrants, then that system got under pressure, and countries like Greece and Italy couldn't deal with the influx of refugees. And that created a lot of the problems that we had in 2015 and 2016. In the meantime, Europe has started to play a bigger role in custom agencies that the different member states have, but it's still not a system like we have here in the United States, basically, where we have one, what is it called again, USCIS or something like that, a United States Citizen and Immigration Services, that's basically control entry into all 50 United States. In Europe, you could say each state still has control over this, but at least as a result of the crisis 8 years ago, the EU is now playing a bigger role in this and giving financial support also to the southern states to improve their border system. Some colleagues call the way that the European Union operates in this kind of context as failing forward. Europe fails at something, at dealing with a crisis, but then takes a few steps to deal with it. It doesn't take all the steps that are necessary to deal with a problem well, because there's no consensus on doing so, no consensus amongst the 27 member states to give up power to the European Union. And that is what is needed. If the EU wants to acquire more power, all 27 member states have to agree to give that power to the EU. So they're always reluctant to take too many steps. And then at some point, there's another crisis and they take another step. But most of the time you can see, more steps are needed. But these steps are not taken until the EU fails at dealing with some situation or problem. And so, but so far, it always fails forward. It fails and then it moves forward towards more integration. Of course, at some point, maybe it could fail completely, but that has not happened yet. Anyway, to what do you attribute Germany's more organized and generous treatment of the refugees compared to Greece, Bulgaria, etc.? I would say indeed, as you suggest here, Kay, that a good part of the story there is that Germany needed immigrants, basically. If you look at the demographics in Germany, they're not good at all. And that is true for a number of other countries as well. But the population in Germany is aging, more so than in some other European countries. And people live longer. And that is a bigger problem in Europe, in Germany and in other European countries. That's a bigger problem even than that is in the United States. Why? Because the social welfare system in Europe is usually more generous than in the United States. So there are more expenditures going to people who need help from the government for all kinds of reasons, because they are low income, for example, but also because they are old and retired, and retired or older people need the healthcare system more often than younger people, as we all know. So having a demographic composition of your population where the older people, the group of older people becomes bigger and bigger, and the younger generation smaller and smaller, is an even bigger problem in Europe than it is here, because the social welfare system is more generous. So Germany is a rich country, but it doesn't have enough kids, basically. So they had a need for immigrants. And Germany in 2015, they welcomed about 1 million people, 1 million refugees were taken in just by Germany alone. Now we are 8 years further. Do you hear a lot about these problems that Germany has now as a result of 1 million refugees? No. Every once in a while, there's a story about some crime committed by some refugee or so who came in 2015. But by and large, you don't hear about any problems. And it seems that the integration of this 1 million, this group of 1 million people into German society, and especially into the German economy, went quite well. It's not the case that they took jobs away from other people. If you look at German unemployment figures, they are about as low as they are here in the United States. So this large influx of people, 1 million people for 80 million Germans, so that the equivalent would be here 4 or 5 million people moving into the refugees being accepted in the US in 1 year. That all went quite well. So the demographics in Germany are different than in some countries in Southern Europe. And the other thing, of course, is if you ask why the attitude towards immigration or letting these refugees in Germany was better than in Greece or Bulgaria. Well, Greece and Bulgaria are poorer countries also. And Greece had all its problems during the sovereign debt crisis, larger or higher unemployment. So Germany could just deal with this better than these other countries. Okay, and there's a comment, my understanding of why Greece does not help immigrants is because they want to deter migration. What other solutions could Greece or neighboring countries take? That, of course, is a big problem, I think, or something that I think we don't really know where or how we can strike a good balance here. Of course, when you and I see these images of refugees on the Mediterranean, almost sinking, sometimes sinking, sometimes with catastrophic consequences, we all feel a lot of sympathy for these refugees, and that is a normal reaction. And of course, the normal thing to do then is to ask the governments, the local governments, in many cases the Greek government, the Italian government, to help out these refugees. Now, the point of these governments, the point that some of these governments then make, and that is also what the Greeks say now, is, well, we cannot do that. We cannot just patrol amongst the Greek islands and the Turkish coastline and pick up everybody who just wants to come over, because this will have a pull effect. If we have, let's say, a whole line of boats there, then people will just swim out even 50 meters to this line of Greek vessels. And this will encourage people even more to try to cross the Mediterranean. And as a result, there will be even more refugees, which would not be good for the countries also where they come from. So there's a lot of arguments being made against trying to help refugees. Now, of course, this argument seems very often comes across as very cold and inhumane, and I think to a large extent these arguments are like that. But on the other hand, it's probably also true that by patrolling, by having a lot of Greek vessels there to help out refugees, you cannot deny that probably as a result of that, it's almost inevitable that you attract more refugees. Then the question is, well, how do you deal with that? How do you set up a system that deals with refugees in a humane way without amplifying the problem? And I think I mean, a lot of things I've done there. I don't claim that I have the answers to all this, but to some extent, that is the situation that the EU is struggling with now. And whatever solution they come up with, like some agreements have been made, as you know, with Turkey and also with Tunisia, to keep refugees there in Turkey and in Tunisia to prevent them from getting to the water and process their asylum applications in Turkey and in Tunisia. There are some well intentions behind all this, but these type of approaches also get criticized because then you get these arguments, well, you're making a deal with the dictator in Turkey or with an undemocratic regime in Tunisia. And of course, these regimes, they're not going to say, oh, yes, we are going to allow these refugees to stay here. We're going to keep them here while you process their asylum applications, and we're going to put them up here. No, they want to be paid for that. They want something in return. So then you end up making a deal with dictators and undemocratic regimes. And that is also something that a lot of people don't like. A lot of the organizations, non-governmental organizations don't like that. A lot of politicians don't like that. So that is not the ideal solution either. So it's a complicated problem, and I don't claim that I have the best solution to it. Let's see what other points are being made. Yeah, so of course, Germany has a history that it still feels very guilty about, and it to a large extent still determines German foreign policy today. I don't know whether that played that big a role in their attitude towards welcoming refugees. It could have played a role. I do think what played a role is the fact that Angela Merkel was a prime minister, was chancellor of Germany at that time. And as you may know, Angela Merkel was one of the longest serving prime ministers, heads of government in Germany. She was there from 2005 to 2021, I believe, for 16 years. She was not known as being the most courageous or the most visionary leader, but she did take a strong stand on the refugee issue. And she pronounced the words, the phrase that has become quite well known in European politics. At some point, she said, "Wir schaffen das," in response to questions about what they had to do about the influx of refugees and so on. She said, "Wir schaffen das," we'll manage. And of course, people who were very skeptical about immigration sort of blame her for having said that and having encouraged, in their opinion at least, even more refugees to come over. But what was her background? She was a Christian Democratic leader. She was the daughter of a minister, a religious, not a government minister, but a religious minister who moved to East Germany. Her father moved to East Germany to help out people there in some parish. So she grew up in East Germany, and she had to witness there the effects that the war had on these communities. Refugees also, a lot of Germans were displaced after World War II. And that was a story that stayed with her. And people say that to some extent, it was as a result of that Germany had such a positive attitude towards these refugees at the height of the crisis, that it was inspired by her and by her background. US foreign policy contributes to creating more refugees. Yes, that's what a lot of people would say, and that's US foreign policy, to some extent also European foreign policy. And of course, you can go further back in history also and look at European colonialism decades ago, that contributed to a lot of ethnic problems in the Middle East and elsewhere. And that created a situation that caused all these displacements of people, all these refugee crises. Do we know the status of Sarah, the older sister? I actually was looking for that a couple of days ago, and I don't think there is an update. I didn't find an update. The one thought that I had, so as you may remember, Sarah, the older sister, she did not participate in the Olympics, but she decided that she was going to work for an NGO, I believe, and help out refugees that end up in Greece. And I believe she was arrested or at least indicted for having illegally helped refugees or something. And she's waiting to see what the judicial process in Greece will do. Now, the one thought that I had when I watched this movie was that this movie is going to give her a lot more notoriety, and that will make it difficult for Greece to go ahead with this politically. There will be a price for Greece if they go ahead and she gets convicted. I'm sure that there will be a lot of negative press coverage of this, and I wouldn't be surprised if, because of that they would sort of let her go or sort of forget about this case altogether. We'll see. I don't know, but that was the one thought that I had when I watched the movie and saw what what the situation, what Sarah's choice was. Shannon, do you have an update that you found, or?
I don't have, I mean, I just looked on the internet, and what I read said that she had been actually in jail awaiting trial for a while, but then the charges were dropped or something, and legal people were excited that would help set the precedent for other cases also and stuff. But I wanted to, like, one thing that really struck me, and I appreciated that the movie showed the frustration of the cousin who went with them. And apparently they actually did have two cousins, and that the two actors who played the sisters are sisters in real life.
Yeah.
The more I learned about the real story, you know, the more interesting it was. But the cousin who, when they're in Germany, he's like, there's nothing for me here. You know, I don't have a job. I can't work. I'm just waiting. It's only waiting. I wish I hadn't come. And it was interesting because when you were talking about the debate between whether people are truly refugees or whether they're economic migrants, it's interesting how we categorize people, right? When they are refugees, because we accept some categories as making people special, like age, right? If you're a baby or you're under 18, you know, we can agree that you should receive special considerations. But then it gets to a really gray area for me, I guess, when even her father and her parents, for Sarah and Yusra, the father's like, you're a swimmer, that has to count for something, right? And so they're refugees from this war-torn, you know, from bombings, right? But the reason the father thinks that they'll be successful in seeking asylum is because they have something to offer. They have a special talent, special ability, special skills, right? So that makes it sound more like not an economic migrant, but a talent migrant or something, you know? Because the thing is, if they're refugees, everybody in that country is a refugee. You know what I mean? Like, but it gets into a really gray area for me. And I don't know. I'm glad that the film at least raised that question a little bit of like, you know, what do you do if you're not special? And then the whole thing about family reunion being allowed if you're under 18, and so they had to race against time for her birthday and stuff. And I don't know, it becomes so complicated.
Yes, and in a lot of countries in Europe, there's more focus on that now, on sort of having a more proactive immigration policy and looking for people who have talents in whatever the area may be, and whether it be swimming or in engineering or something like that. And often in political discussions in European countries, they refer to the United States then. And the US has been doing this to some extent for a long time with all its visa systems and so on. Whereas a lot of European countries, to a large extent, when there was immigration, it was immigration not sort of these countries looking for talents, but basically looking for people to do the jobs that most people in Europe didn't want to do, where they had shortages, whether it be factory workers or something like that. And then related to that also, in some countries, quite generous family reunion policies, and to show how current this actually still is even today. Just this past, well, maybe it was not this past week, but the week before, in one of the EU countries, the government fell on this very topic, on changes to the family reunion policies that exist for immigration into that country. And I'm talking about the Netherlands. Now, this is a good example, basically, of some mainstream parties, the right-wing Liberal Party in the Netherlands, and its prime minister. I think they've done a reasonably good job governing the country. This prime minister, Rutte, has been prime minister since 2010. He's the longest-serving prime minister. but his party is not doing all that well in the polls, or wasn't. And there's, in the Netherlands, every couple of years, a new far-right party coming up and taking away a lot of votes. So he wanted to make a point. His party actually wanted to make a point, wanted to draw a line on family reunion policies and making them stricter. And then some of the parties in the government, a left liberal party and a Christian religious party, they didn't want to go along with this. And that basically led to the fall of the government and new elections. So in November, the elections will be in November. So it's an example of a mainstream party, and it makes me kind of sad about the way politics often goes these days, and not just in Europe, but also maybe to some extent here. A mainstream party, seeing that it's not doing all that well in the polls, trying to take one aspect of immigration policies, family reunions, wanting to make them a little bit stricter. Now, it could be that there's a need, that it would make sense to do that. I don't know, but it's clear that they picked a very small issue to try to improve their electoral prospects. And they were in a coalition with two parties that were a bit more on the left. So they knew these parties could not go along with this, and that this would create, this would lead to a new election. So it's, I mean, this issue of immigration is very often used for electoral purposes. And that sort of makes me a bit sad, because it is a very serious issue, as this movie shows. It's about the lives of many people. Anyway, other comments or questions? Maybe one other thing that I was thinking about when Shannon was talking about, I think Shannon was just mentioning that the brother and the sisters actually also, they were waiting quite a while at this facility in Germany where while their applications for asylum were being processed. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries, this does take quite a while. It's not uncommon for this to take a year or so. And then usually during that year, the refugees are not allowed to work or do anything really. In some countries, it's a little bit different, but that creates very problematic situations. And in some countries, of course, you have people there who are not, who get totally bored basically, and don't live in a very nice environment. And of course, that leads to some problems then too. Anyway, another thing I was thinking about when you were saying, Shannon, these people should all be treated the same, whatever their talents are and so on. Another thing that is going on, or that has been going on in Europe, of course, in the past 2 years, is the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has led to another wave of refugees. Now, it's quite interesting to see that this wave of refugees has not met the same reaction that the wave of refugees met in 2015 and 16. And then you can, of course, wonder why. Well, I don't know. You can come up with reasons yourself. Maybe there's an element of racism. And maybe people are thinking, well, these Ukrainians, they look a little bit like us. They're Europeans. So as a result of that, we feel more, we feel closer to them, and we're going to be nicer to them. And that could be part of it. The other thing that is probably also part of the story there is that the demographic makeup of the immigrants is different. So if we look at the Ukrainian immigrants, what happens very often was that the man stayed in Ukraine to fight the Russians, and that the people who fled were women, younger women with their kids. Whereas the refugees who came over, if we look at the refugees who came over from the Middle East, that not all of them, but disproportionately, they were young men, men in their 20s and 30s. So you could also be that people feel more sympathy for a young 25-year-old woman with 2 kids than for a 25-year-old guy, a single guy. That could be. Maybe also if you combine that then with their ethnic background, which we mentioned earlier, if people do feel closer to white Europeans than they do to people, as Lynn here mentions, also with a darker skin, then these are probably the 2 main reasons why the Ukrainian immigrants have been welcomed a lot more so than immigrants from Syria. And okay, this is not because of talents, but because of characteristics that they cannot, that these Syrians and Ukrainians cannot change, basically. So from a fairness perspective, definitely not a very nice story there. All right. We're almost at the end of our hour. I feel like I've been talking so much. That was not my intention. Do you have
your comment was greatly appreciated, because I did not, realize all these policies, all the different driven factors of how refugees was treated. Because I'm a refugee myself, and so I can kind of relate to the movie, and it's pretty realistic. But like you said, if Germany, a rich and welcome immigrant, to provide additional labor shortage there, have they done anything to sort of assist outside of Germany to help the influx of the people?
You mean other countries than Germany?
Germany themselves, because it seems like they can manage the influx of immigrant and welcome the people to come. But have they done anything being outside of their country, like maybe?
Okay, so helped out other European countries. Well, yeah, to a large extent. So the European Union has done that. So they have realized that some countries, especially in the south, and they have more limited budgets, and they have more refugees because that's how they enter the European Union. So the European Union has provided help welcoming the refugees, and also, as I mentioned earlier, for patrolling the borders and so on. So, but of course, as is usually the case in situations like this, if the European Union gives more money, I mean, from the European Union's perspective, okay, they want to have some impact then too. They want to have some control and set some standards and so on. And very often countries don't want that. So there's a little bit of a discussion usually there. Yeah. So yeah, one thing that I realized also, I mean, I have not been a refugee. I emigrated from from Belgium to the United States, but I was not in a situation and not as a refugee. But I think one thing I had to think about is also, when I saw this movie, I had to think about my grandmother. So I'll just tell you this anecdote. This is not a story about the Syrian refugee crisis. My grandmother, my dad's mom, died in 2001, but I do remember that a couple of years before she died, there was a refugee crisis in Kosovo. Remember the Serbs? There was a problem with the Serbs, between the Serbs and the Kosovars, and so there were huge numbers of people fleeing. And I remember visiting my grandmother, and she had just watched the news, and she was crying. And then I asked her why she was crying, and she said, "Oh, I've just watched the news about these refugees." And I sort of stupidly told her, "Well, Grandma, you don't need to worry about this. Kosovo is like more than 1,000 miles away from here. This war is not going to come here." And then she said, well, that's not, she was a bit upset at me. And she said, no, this is not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about 1940, when the Germans, when the Nazis invaded Belgium. What a lot of people did is they fled. So my grandparents, my grandma was pregnant of my dad then. So that was her 5th child. So my grandparents, their 4 kids, and my grandmother pregnant of my dad, they walked west for 7 days to sort of stay away from the Germans. But before they got to the coastline, somewhere in France, the Germans caught up with them. Then they stayed for 2 weeks, and then they walked back for a week. Of course, their house had been looted and stuff like that. But anyway, when I was watching this movie, I was thinking, well, I cannot imagine this. How harsh, how tough this situation is for these refugees. And this is something that a lot of us who have never dealt with this think like, okay, this is something from another era, from another world. This has nothing to do with me. But maybe it is more closer to us than we sometimes think. In Europe, also in Western Europe, this is only 2 generations ago people were fleeing, in that case from the Germans. And for the people who went through that, this may ring still be very fresh in their memory, even though it was 80 years ago. My dad's 2 older sisters passed away, but the 2 brothers are still around, and they were 6 years old at the start of the war. So I'm sure they still remember. And we often forget, also in Europe, I think, the impact that still has had on my parents' generation, and indirectly also on us, I'm sure, without really realizing it all that much. I was born towards the end of the 1960s. I always thought that World War II was something I had nothing to do with, from a different era, totally unrelated to me. But the Germans 22 years before were only gone like 22 years before I was born. So it must have had an impact also on me indirectly, way more than I thought. And who knows? I mean, I hope none of us will ever have to deal with a situation like that anymore. But you never know. Probably people didn't think that Putin would do something like this in Europe in the 21st century. But he did. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the discussion. At least you stayed for the full hour. So I hope you got something out of it. As I said, I talked a little bit more than I was intending to talk, and maybe not as well organized as I would have been if I had thought, okay, I'm going to be talking for an hour here. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the movie, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion also. And as I mentioned, the next movie discussion is on August 30. You can check the Global Studies website and sign up for the mailings about that movie and so on. I'm sure most of you are on the mailing list already, which explains why you're here. In any case, thank you for being here. Thank you for attending this discussion organized by the Europe Center. You can also check our website, the Europe Center, for activities that we have. Sometimes there's interesting talks and so also that we organize that is not just intended for an academic audience. So anyway, I wish you a very good evening, and I hope I'll see you again at some point.
Thank you.
Thanks.